Hello and welcome to Wild Sounds, the film podcast. I'm Kierston Dreyer and this is my co-host Matthew Toffolo. We're a podcast sponsored by the Wild Sound Festival, and today we are doing our 10-part series on films that changed cinematic history. So we're jumping into one of my all-time favorite films. Matt, you ready to talk about something real weird?
Yeah, we're talking something really freaky, I guess, right?
I was going to say freaky. I was like, you want to get freaky? Because we're getting freaky on this podcast today. Well, the truth is we're talking about Freaks from 1932, which I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that most of the films we've done in this mini-series were blockbuster successes. Freaks was an utter failure.
Yeah, but now it's a triumphant success, right? So it's the tortoise with the hare theory.
Oh yeah, no,
right. It doesn't matter how you start; it's how you finish. Yeah,
well, right. It was more than a bomb, and I'll get into why exactly that happened and how that occurred. But this film has been hailed since as not only a classic but a canonized classic, and it was truly ahead of its time. And I'll get into it. So, Matt, you've seen Freaks, right? You saw it recently?
I saw it a couple days ago, yeah.
Yeah. I have watched Freaks probably more than 30 times.
Okay, so before we start anything, you watched this movie 30 times. So I always ask people, what movie have you seen the most times in your life in my interview? It's like my staple question. Is this the movie you've seen the most times in your life?
Full disclosure, the movie I've seen probably most times in my life was when I was about 4 or 5 years old and I was watching the the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer Christmas special, but that was just because it was on repeat constantly and I was 5. That film probably saw about 50 times.
Still holds up today, by the way. I actually showed my wife that, who isn't in that the vernacular of celebrating Christmas, and she, for the first time, and she really loved it as well. So.
Well, I'm not talking about the early 1950s clay animation. I'm talking about like the reboot from like 1992.
That was a stinker. What are you talking about?
It's terrible. It's terrible. But the audience they were pitching for was like 5-year-old Kierston, and I loved it at the time. And I lived in Florida too, so I was like, I never see snow. It was that you're a parent. There are films that you play on repeat because your kids like them. Yeah, that's probably the film I've seen the most. But I don't even remember it now.
Okay, so when did you first watch? Why did you watch Freaks? Like, how did you get introduced to this film? You're only in your like mid-20s. Mm-hmm. It's from 1932, so. If the movie was made 60 years before you were born, so tell me, how did you get into this film? I'm so curious.
Yeah, let's get into it. So I was in college and I was doing first year film studies, and we didn't watch Freaks, but it was in my classic film book, and I was like, what is this? And they were like, it was like the scandalous films of cinematic history, and I was like, Freaks, like 1932 about circus performers, like how weird is that? And then I read about why it was banned in several countries and not allowed to be seen anywhere and rioted at when it was shown, and scandalized crowds by the and they couldn't even premiere it. And I was like, I gotta figure out why. What is so scandalous in the 1930s that we can't see now? Really, that this is gonna be a cakewalk if I watch this. This isn't gonna scare me. And I gotta say, it's a true horror film. And it's not a horror film because it's scary. It's a horror film because it horrifies. And it horrifies, but it horrifies in a way that I think was beyond ahead of its time. Of course people didn't want to watch it, were afraid to show it, banned it in countries. Nobody wanted to take a realistic look at these people's lives. And this film is iconic now because it attempted to do something that it attempted to paint a realistic picture through a fictional lens of real human beings that society was shunning. Ultimately, nobody likes to be reminded. Okay, there's a great line from the musical Wicked. There are precious few at ease with moral ambiguities, and so we act as though they don't exist. And that's exactly what this film was thesising.
Some people could describe this as a film that it's its own unique genre. It's as you describe it, it's like a horror movie, but it's not a horror movie in the classic sense per se. It's more of a horrific movie of what they're trying to show you. And it's really, I remember even growing up and going to the circus, I'm thinking to myself, why didn't they ever make a movie about these characters? They're so interesting and they're so pardon the pun, freaky. And of course they did way back in the day, and of course it bombed the box office. And I don't know if you know this, but you know that Tom Brownie, who actually has made some pretty good films, he's actually got a pretty good film career himself. But he joined the circus when he was 16.
Yeah, no,
And
I know. I did
Yeah.
all the history direction on this piece, and I was like, no wonder he had a soft spot in his heart for the circus performers. He was in the circus when he was 16. He lived this life.
Like he left. I guess his family was really rich, and he actually left home and ran away from home and joined. It's like a classic cliche. He ran away from home and joined the circus.
That's where the cliche comes from.
Yeah.
So this is a fantastic film, and I want to give a content warning. By today's standards, the terms that they're using and the terms that
Sure.
I'm going to be quoting here, because it was the way they were billed at the time, I will say that as well. So content warning. By today's standards, this film can be easily considered exploitative, and it can be, in like the terms used are certainly not terms that are acceptable today. But for the time, this piece was trying very hard to be an inclusive film and trying to give a real, true acting jobs to people who were probably otherwise kind of stuck in a trade of peddling their, air quotes, oddities of themselves, the oddity that was themselves as a spectacle. This film attempted to take that and give these people a real job with real acting chops behind it. So I'm going to get into what they are as well. So you want to get into the history of this film?
I just yeah, totally. Just like I said, I just know the director basically, like, he created it, he wrote this script, and it's based on his life, so he kind of he nailed the tone because he was from this universe as well. Talk about research, right? About making a film. Like, he literally experienced this thing, and I know it was a pretty high budget at the time for 1932. It was like the $300,000 range, and they did not make their money back. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so this is a film where, first of all, to give, like Todd Browning had lived experience, right? He didn't intentionally try to exploit anybody. He worked in the circus for years under people who were billed as the bearded lady and the living skeleton, and like he saw their lives and was like, why isn't anybody talking about this? Why isn't anybody painting a realistic picture about this? So let's jump back to like what the film is about, because I'm sure people are curious by now. We've built it up enough. So this film is about a beautiful starlet who joins a, air quotes, freak circus and attempts to seduce a performer to gain access to his money. And the film is iconic because it employed real circus entertainers who made their living as professional, air quotes, oddities because of their birth defects or congenital conditions. Exploitative, certainly by today's standards, but groundbreaking in the 1930s. So, directed by Todd Browning, as you mentioned, who joined the circus at 16 and grew up in this world. He had a pretty prolific career as a director, but it was derailed in the 1920s because he was an alcoholic. And that did kind of get the better of his professional world for a bit. Freaks was originally based off a 1917 novel that had the same basic concept, like a air quotes normal person who gets into a love triangle in a circus with somebody who is billed as a circus performer for the way they look, and who's a little person, and a third lover as well. So MGM paid $8,000 for the rights of the story in hopes that the property would rival the horror movies that were being cranked out by the competitor Universal. Reportedly, Browning promised the studio that he was going to release the ultimate horror picture. But when we think about horror, like, we're not talking about slasher, gasher. Well, there's a little bit of that in there. We'll get into the ending. But, like, he talked about, like, I'm going to horrify you. I'm going to show you something you're not prepared to see, and I'm going to make you deal with it. Would you say that carries over when you see the film?
Yeah, and I'm just, from the plot standpoint, I'm curious where because this is a very this plot has been done before, where someone jumps into money and someone tries to manipulate them into marriage to get that money, and of course they're going to steal the money from that person. And I think it happens on every single soap opera that's taking place right now on television. And it happens in, like, there's so many film examples as well. So the plot is very unique in its nature, right? And of course, she's actually in love with the strongman, the Hercules character, I guess, right?
Yeah. So the leading lady, the starlet, who comes onto the set, or to the circus, falls in love likes the Hercules guy, likes the strongman, but she seduces this little person named Hans. And because he comes from money, he has a trust fund, essentially. And here's the thing. This isn't a documentary. This is a fictional horror film with, you could say, like a pulp-esque story behind it. You know, a classic love triangle for money and it's body and sexual and all of those things. But it required real acting chops. The performer who plays Hans, I'll get into his backstory. This was a real acting jobs. Like, some of the people who were billed, who were cast, had intellectual disabilities, but they still did their very best to give them scenes. This was an ensemble piece. Every person had a scene that showed them at, I would argue, at their most compassionate, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so the work features many famous people such as Johnny Eck, and I'm just going to go out on the limb here and say, if you look at pictures of Johnny Eck, this guy is classically handsome. If you could absolutely see him like as a news anchor. He's got this charm and this beautiful face. He's a good-looking guy, and if he was born in today's world, I could see him having a long and illustrious film career. Because he has a great, wonderful personality, and you can tell he's got acting chops. He was born with a truncated torso due to sacroiligenesis, which essentially means he was born with a full body but an underdeveloped lower half. So his legs and feet were underdeveloped and unusable. So he had them hidden under a custom-made clothing and cushion and was billed by freaks as the, air quotes, half boy. He was actually a twin and was walking on his hands before his brother was even able to stand. So and they actually ended up moving in together later after he, like when they grew up and when he got out of the film world. He was, so several performers were born with microcephalus, so they had smaller than standard sized craniums, and I think at the time they were quoted as pinheads, which is a completely unacceptable term today. Harry Earls played the male lead and the major love interest. He plays Hans, and he's actually one of 7 children, 4 of whom had dwarfism. And in fact, the girl who he's engaged to in the film is his biological sister, who also suffers from the same condition. Fun fact. So
it's a little gross, yeah.
Pardon?
It's a little gross,
well,
but yeah.
No, they're biological brother and sister in reality because they had to cast people who had the same.
No, I get it.
Yeah, but in the film they were like, perfect.
Like, you imagine being in a film and your brother and you are cast as fiancés? Like,
in this situation, I mean, personally, I think it was kind of cool, like because they were actually a performing troupe, the 4 siblings with dwarfism. With this type of dwarfism, because it was a really interesting type of dwarfism. Not only were they short in stature, but they were perfectly proportioned. They looked like, and they also looked very, very young. Like when you look at Harry Earls and his sister, they have the cherub-like faces of, say, like 4 or 5-year-olds or even younger, but they are about only maybe 4 feet tall. But it's almost like they don't age. Of course they do. You can see pictures of them later, but they age very young looking. So he's perfectly proportionate. He's engaged to someone else who is the same condition, who is his biological sister. They're fully grown. He's like a completely intellectual. There's no intellectual disability associated with this. They're completely fully grown, developed looking, but they're about as tall as a 4-year-old and look about the same. So he plays against his sister, and they actually grew up being like a traveling entertaining band, right? So they had grown up their entire lives being entertainers. And this film also features Prince Radian, who played in the movie. His birth name is unknown, and he was born with tetraamelia syndrome, which is a situation where you're born without any of your limbs. So he just was, he had his face and his torso. He's famous in the film for an incredible set of footage of him filling, rolling, lighting, and smoking a cigar by himself with only his mouth. Fun fact, he fathered 4 children with his wife. The idea behind this piece is that Hans's fiance and bride-to-be keeps telling him, you cannot be with this woman who is seducing you. She wants your money. Please don't go out with her. And he ends up breaking up his engagement to be with this other woman. And ultimately, it's because she supplies him what he thinks normalcy is. Because she's this Amazonian-like, tall, beautiful, Romanesque woman going after him and completely deceiving and lying to him, but he believes her because he so badly wants to think that he and her can be together, that he is what she wants. In reality, though, she's using him the entire way and manipulating him all the while. And there's this fantastic piece. If you Google Golden Age of Video, they have it in there. It's the song We Accept Her, One of Us, the Gooble Gobble song, where they pass around this goblet and she freaks out because she can't She doesn't want to be part of their group. Even though they accept her with open arms, she can't accept them. It's very I want to say like romantic fiction, but it's a lot more like melodrama, right? So the impact on society, the studio was super unhappy with this film. Like, so unhappy. They tested 3 different alternative endings with test audiences, and the backlash was so dramatic. Like, people were so offended, so horrified, so terrified by this film, and it had such a dramatic outlash from critics that they pulled the movie and shelved it. And Browning's reputation was utterly ruined, and several of the performers, I believe several of the performers ultimately regretted their involvement with the work. But Freaks was ahead of its time. It intentionally cast people with real lived experience in the lives they were leading. They could have cast, air quotes, normal people who didn't have the lived experience or the conditions that they were showing and use special effects to make them look that way, but they didn't. They went out of their way to make sure that every person cast had experience with what they were doing and that every person cast had a scene depicting who they really were, like Prince Radarin being shown what he could do, like how the incredible talent it takes to be able to roll stuff and smoke a cigarette using only your mouth. So Freaks attempted to put a real face on what was at the time a completely underrepresented community that was scoffed at. Even though many circus performers made ridiculous money, it made an effort to cast people who lived authentically in their roles, and it tried to convey a sympathetic look, even though it was telling a very Pulp Fiction-esque kind of, well, not Pulp Fiction. You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying Pulp Fiction the movie, Pulp Fiction the genre. Like, it tried to use a very it told a very melodramatic story about love and bodiness and horror, but it really did try to put a sympathetic look on the face of the lives of the people who were living the characters. So,
if I correct me if I'm wrong, they basically shelved the studio MGM, shelved the film, and then they this is the first time they ever did that where they wouldn't show the film, and they cut it from like its original, it was like 90 minutes, and they cut it to 64 minutes just so they can get it out there and try to make some sort of their investment back on their film. And then all the critics hated it. Like every single critic destroyed the film. Like all the major critics destroyed the film. And then it kind of made a renaissance back in the I think in the 60s where they started showing it at midnight screenings, and then it became this huge kind of phenomenon, this like cult hit back in the day, right?
Yeah. Keep in mind that this film wasn't just like critically bashed; it was banned in countries around the world.
Yeah. Like I think UK banned it, but even again, UK banned Clockwork Orange for a long time too. So
yeah, we should do Clockwork Orange. That's a great one. I love Clockwork Orange. But then I can't. I was watching it now. I'm like, why would they ban this? And then I was like, oh wait, it's because nobody was comfortable. We were too insecure with the audience that was going to circuses to look at these people and eyeball them as though they were oddities, was now being forced to look at them as real people playing characters that could hold up to, like, if this had been done as a regular workplace drama with completely air quotes normal people, people would have watched it and been like, seems like a fine movie to me. But because it was with people who were different, everyone went, oh god, we can't watch that. And I think that's why it was subversive, and that's why it needs to be seen. Like, certainly you can consider it exploitative by today's standards due to, you know, the way they're talking to the people, the way they're, like, the names they're giving people, but they really went out of their way to give them real acting positions and to give them humanizing looks at their lives. Yeah,
and so the director, Todd Browning, what we're talking about, he couldn't really get work after making this film because it got, like, the studio was so upset with them in the making of the film. So he died before he ever saw any sort of renaissance in this film. And it's kind of interesting because sometimes it's always interesting the things think like I heard someone bought the film from MGM because they thought it was a stupid film, like in their eyes. But it's always interesting, like, what other film is out there that just doesn't get that renaissance because of various luck reasons or whatever.
So what did you, I'm curious about this. Like, I love the film because even today we don't see stuff like this. Like,
no, that's what I'm saying. It reminded me as a child when I went to the circus. and I was like watching like all these kind of interesting characters, and then the elephant was. I was fascinated at the time with the elephant pooping because he just pooped all the time, and I was like, my God, he poops a lot, and I'm like, why they should make a movie. Like I had no idea. I thought I was getting into sports right at this time, so like I had no idea. I'm like would have this conversation with you today and doing what I'm doing that now. So. But I'm like, they should make a movie about the circus. There's so many interesting characters and stuff. And it's like, I wonder why they don't. And it's like, and I think there's something to it. And even today where it's like people want to feel comfortable with their leading characters, right? They could be despicable like Tony Soprano, but they're comfortable with them because they kind of understand who he is and they know him, right?
Well, everybody wants to resonate and like everybody wants to identify with the hero. And when the hero is what you would consider not like you, the only person you can identify with is the villain. And nobody liked that. Because the only person you could identify with as an air quotes normal person who had no, say, oddities about them is the villain. The woman who's trying to steal the money and ruin somebody's life. 2 people's lives. And that's deeply disturbing to viewers. I think especially in the 1930s. What do you think?
Of course, that's exactly what it is, and I understand, like, but it's always interesting where the critics are like, it's like critics kind of help films out, like if it gets all kinds of great reviews, because right now this film is at 94% on Rotten Tomatoes, right? So, but every critic, like of all the mainstream critics, like destroyed this film, like they didn't like this film, and like that's always makes me like laugh, like sometimes it's like a cliche, but sometimes things are ahead of its time. Sometimes things are not being seen with the lens that it should be seen because of the times that we're in, right? Mm-hmm. Like of course, like look at all the films that we've shown at our festival in the last 6 months that people think there's all this political implications that are in the themes because of what's happening today, right? Like the craziness that's happening today. Sorry for some audience members who disagree with that. It's fucking craziness. And basically, so like people try to think of like they look for hints, right? So 1932, like people, there's that film Gulliver's Travel, right? I don't know if you watched this film Gulliver's Travel. And it's about it's about a filmmaker who loses his way, and he wants to make important films, and because he's always making films for Hollywood, and so whatever happens, and he goes on his like great adventure, and he ends up in a homeless shelter in the 1930s, and they end up showing a film, and for 2 hours the audience is laughing at this Hollywood film, and they're relieving themselves of their grief, they're relieving themselves of their anxiety for 2 hours, and he finally realizes that wait a minute. This is what movies are about for a lot of people. Like it's about escapism. It's about entertainment. It's not about making an important statement. So the lens of 1932 is that most people are not doing well. So they don't want to watch a movie that's about these people. Like, you know what I mean? And like, you know, and that's the bottom line. So if the movie's made comes out in 1947, where everybody's generally doing pretty well for themselves, like they've gone through this 15-year horror of like the war and then of course the Depression, then maybe the lens is different when they watch this film because they're able to express themselves and go into this world better than they were in 1932.
It's hard to say, really, because the truth is, I think you've pegged something really well, is that it was the middle of the Depression, and actually it was still early Depression, but it's hard to watch a film that kind of says, hey, look at what you're doing to a group of people. These people are humans. And then being like, well, my life is hard. You just made it harder because you made me deal with something that makes me uncomfortable. Because, yeah, I've gone to circuses and I've paid pennies to look at these people because they're different than me. And that's deeply...
They want those people to be humanized.
Yeah, they don't. And that's the thing. Even today, we don't see this kind of diversity in our shows. We don't see, like, there was La Carnival, which kind of did like a Freaks style thing about being about circuses. But like, how many shows do we see where we see people who are considered air quotes different and like abnormal and that are in a conventional normalized role? It's rare. It's few. There are more examples certainly now than there were in the past, but at 1930 it was unheard of. So this film was ahead of its time, and it breaks my heart that it was received so poorly, but at the same time even by today's audiences, it can be uncomfortable to watch. And it's up to us to dissect why we're uncomfortable and get past that. Because ultimately, it's a great film. It's really cool. It's creepy. It's weird. It's got great performances in it. It shows us a part of the world we don't normally see. And it's a classic melodrama, drama horror, right?
100%. And like, of course, because of the Renaissance, a lot of filmmakers have used certain aspects of this film in their own film. So it's really kind of like paved the way for future films as well.
Yeah, there are nods to Freaks in other places that
sure,
you can see.
Everywhere, yeah.
Yeah, if you know Freaks as a film, you can spot the nods in other places, and it's kind of like a secret language. Like, oh, that's a Freaks thing. Now, what did you
watch American Horror Story? American Horror Story is like gives tribute to this. I was like, cause I watched the series, and I'm like, wait a minute. Now I understand the you know what I mean? Now there's so much parallel between, I think it's the fourth season especially, right? When they actually went to a freak show in the series. Yeah, so this is, this film is, I'm glad to finally have seen it. So thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, so what did you think of it when you saw it? Like, because, I mean, I've watched this film a bunch of times, but every time it's, it's uncanny.
Yeah, it's funny because when I first watched it, like this is like I'm going to reveal this, but I'm actually like I'm a wrestling fan, so I watch wrestling, and it's my escapism. So back in the late '90s, there was like this wrestling stable called the Oddities, and there are all these freaks. There's all these people that were freaks, and like from like one was like 7'5". There was like a little person. There was like you know what I mean? Like, it was kind of like the same thing, and it made the audience so uncomfortable. Like usually in the black and white world of wrestling, there's like baby faces and there's heels. It was like they were like somewhere in between, and it made people so uncomfortable. It actually wasn't a success at all because people the audience did not take to this oddity stable, and it just reminded me of this that faction. The movie reminded me of that faction, that wrestling faction, because there's so much tribute to these. Obviously, a writer of the WWE back in the day was a fan of this show of this movie because they were giving so many tributes to this movie in that stable. But it failed because people are uncomfortable. They don't know whether to laugh and cheer for these people or whether to make them villains. Like there's like, you know what I mean? It's just like you're right. Today, still people are still uncomfortable watching this film.
Yeah, people still are, and that's what's fascinating to me. How much have we really changed? Like we're more accepting, which is fantastic. But it's up to us to watch these films and go look at the bigger picture, look at the scope. Like it's up to us to see these things and experience them and normalize them too, right? So this is why I think this is why I love this movie. So Freaks is now famous because it truly was ahead of its time. It horrified audiences because it was risky to show the true lives of circumstances of certain people, although it is a story that's told in a totally fictional way. It tried very hard to not fictionalize the reality of the characters' lives, of the people playing those characters' lives. So yeah, that's what I've got for Freaks. You got anything else, Matt?
I got nothing else. You were so excited about this podcast, so I was like so excited happy to do it. Yeah,
I was chomping at the bit every time we recorded. Like, want to do Freaks today? Can we do Freaks today?
Yeah.
All right. So I sometimes type words that go on Twitter, and there's not that many of them, but I will tweet more. Come follow me at the Kierstonator. So KIERSTONATOR. You can also find Matt at Matthew Toffolo, TOFFOLO at Twitter. You can reach the podcast at podcast@wildsoundpodcast. Or you can tweet to the hosts at Wild Sound Pod. We want to hear what your favorite classic film was. What movie do you think we should do next? So, Matt, that's what I got for you today. What's next?